He didn't order a wife because he wanted one. He ordered her because he was dying. Not from any disease a doctor could name. Not from a wound or a fever or bad whiskey. He was dying the way men die when they've been alone too long. Slowly, quietly, in a cabin so far up the mountain that no one would find the body until spring. Gideon Vale had survived a war that broke better men. He had survived winters that killed entire settlements, but he could not survive what was coming for him, and neither could she. If this story already has you gripping the edge of your seat, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The trapline ran 6 miles through some of the ugliest terrain in the northern frontier, and Gideon Vale walked every inch of it alone. He had been walking it alone for 11 years. The rocky cliffs above Frost Hollow Ridge didn't care about that. Neither did the wind, which at that elevation came screaming off the high peaks without warning, a sound like a living thing that had learned how to be cruel. In February, temperatures dropped low enough to freeze the spit in a man's mouth before it hit the ground. The snow didn't fall up there so much as it was thrown, driven sideways by gusts that could knock a horse off its footing on the narrow ledge trails. Gideon moved through it like he'd been made from it. He was 42 years old, and he looked every year of it. The war had started carving his face when he was 23, and the mountain had finished the job. The scar that ran from his left temple down to the corner of his jaw was the most visible one, but not the worst. The worst ones were the kind you couldn't see, the kind that lived behind the eyes. He was a large man, not the kind of large that came from good eating and idle living, but the hard, functional kind built by hauling heavy loads up steep grades in all weather. His hands were rough enough to strike a match against. His voice, when he used it, was low and unhurried, the way a man speaks when he's used to talking only to himself. That particular Tuesday morning in late November, he was checking the eastern portion of the line, 4 traps set along a frozen creek bed where a family of minks had been working a section of exposed bank. He found 2 of them triggered and empty, the prey having pulled free. The third held a small stone marten, frozen solid. The fourth had been dragged to the end of its chain and mangled by something bigger. He crouched beside the ruined 4th trap, reading the snow the way another man might read a newspaper. Deep, wide print. Heavy drag. A big male wolverine working the same line, following the scent of trapped animals to an easy meal. "Damn," he said, to no one. He packed up what was salvageable, reset what he could, and started back. The return trip took 2 hours on a good day. That day it took closer to 3, because he turned his ankle on a patch of ice hidden beneath fresh powder on the descent. A stupid mistake, the kind a man makes when his mind is somewhere else. He sat in the snow for a moment, breathing through his teeth. That was when it happened. Not anything dramatic, not a revelation. Just the cold arithmetic of a man sitting alone on a mountain with a throbbing ankle and the knowledge that if it had been worse, a real break, a compound fracture, he would have been finished. 6 miles from the cabin. No one who knew where he was. No one who would come looking. He'd made it back, limping, and stood inside his dark cabin with the wind shaking the walls and the fire reduced to embers. And he thought about what that would have looked like. Dying on the slope. Nobody finding him until the snow melted in April, the traps running all winter with no one to check them. It wasn't the dying that bothered him so much. It was the nobody. He built the fire back up, ate cold beans from the pot on the stove, and sat in the one good chair he owned. The left rear leg had a crack in it he kept meaning to fix. And he looked at the 4 walls of the cabin and he tried to remember the last real conversation he'd had. October. A supply run to Frost Hollow. The store owner, Aldous Pratt, had asked him whether he wanted his flour in a 20-pound sack or 2 tens. That was it. That was the last conversation he could remember. He got up, walked to the small writing desk in the corner, pulled out a sheet of paper he'd bought 2 years ago for reasons he couldn't recall, and uncapped the ink. He stared at the blank page for a long time. Then he started writing the most desperate letter of his life. Evelyn Mercer's problem was that she had told the truth. If she'd kept her mouth shut, if she'd smoothed it over the way a sensible woman was supposed to, the way her mother would have, she would have been fine. She would have kept her position as a private secretary at the firm of Hargrove and Associates in Boston, Massachusetts. She would have kept her room at the boarding house on Marlowe Street with the good window that caught the morning sun. She would have kept the small, careful life she'd built from scratch after arriving in the city at 21 with nothing but a secondhand dress and an ability to read faster than anyone in the room. Instead, she had gone to the firm's senior partner, a man named Victor Hale, and told him exactly what his business partner, a man named Dwight Colburn, had done to her in the file room on a Thursday afternoon in late September. She had named it clearly. She hadn't softened it. That was her mistake. Not the truth itself, but the belief that the truth would matter. Victor Hale had listened to everything she said, his expression never changing, his hands folded on his desk like a man sitting through a dull business presentation. When she finished, he had thanked her for bringing it to his attention. He told her to take the rest of the day off. He said he would handle it. He did handle it. He handled it by making sure every firm in Boston heard that Evelyn Mercer was a troubled woman, a fabricator, a girl who'd made up stories about a respected man because she'd been passed over for a small promotion and couldn't accept it gracefully. He'd had it done quietly, through channels, in the way that wealthy men in powerful positions can destroy a person without ever putting anything in writing. Within 6 weeks, she had lost her job, her room, and 3 friendships she'd believed were solid. She was 29 years old, broke, and notorious in a city where her name was now shorthand for a particular kind of woman, the difficult kind, the unstable kind, the kind employers warned other employers about in hushed voices over cigars. She had $2.40 to her name when she saw the advertisement. She found it in a folded newspaper someone had left on a bench in a public park. She'd been sitting there because she had nowhere else to be. The ad was small, set in plain type, crammed into the back pages between notices for livestock auctions and requests for skilled ironworkers. Seeking, a woman of practical temperament, must be willing to relocate to the northern frontier, say, Frost Hollow Ridge, Montana Territory. Life is hard. The work is real. I am not a gentleman, but I'm an honest one. I will not make promises I cannot keep. Write to G. Vale, General Post, Frost Hollow, Montana. She read it twice. Then she folded the newspaper, put it in her coat pocket, and went back to her boarding house, or what used to be her boarding house. She had 3 days left on the arrangement she'd made with the new landlady, a woman who'd taken 2 weeks' paid rent up front and had spent every day since making Evelyn feel like a charity case. She sat on the edge of the bed in the small room and held the folded newspaper in her hands and thought about it. She wasn't naive. She knew what a mail order arrangement was. She knew the risks. A stranger, a remote location, no one to call for help if things went wrong. No way out except on foot through mountains she'd never seen. She also knew what staying in Boston looked like. She wrote the letter that night by candlelight because the landlady had turned the gas off early again. She wrote it in plain, honest sentences. She told him her real name, her real age, her real situation. Not all of it, but enough. She said she wasn't a delicate woman, even if she looked like one. She said she could learn what she needed to learn. She said she was not running toward him so much as she was running away from something that had already finished destroying her, and she thought he deserved to know the difference. She sealed it and mailed it before she could think better of it. His reply came in 11 days. It was 9 sentences long. The handwriting was rough but readable, like a man who'd learned to write properly and then let the skill go unpracticed for years. Miss Mercer, I received your letter. I will not pretend I have read many others, and yours stood out for some romantic reason. You wrote honestly, and that is all I asked for. I should tell you the winters here are worse than anything you've likely imagined. I should also tell you I am a man with a bad temper, I keep controlled, and a past I do not discuss in letters. If you come, I will treat you fairly. I cannot promise you more than that. I've enclosed money for the coach fare. You can keep it whether you come or not. G. Vale. She read it 4 times. She packed her suitcase the following morning. The handle was broken on one side, so she tied it with a strip of cloth she'd torn from an old apron. She had 2 dresses, 3 books, a set of good boots she'd bought with her last real paycheck, and the letter with the return address. She told no one where she was going. No one asked. The stagecoach from the railhead at Billings to Frost Hollow took 2 days and 1 night across terrain that got progressively less forgiving the further north it went. Evelyn shared the compartment for the first leg with a traveling preacher and a very large man who sold farm equipment and slept with his mouth open. The second leg, she was alone. She watched Montana Territory through the scratched window glass. She'd grown up in Connecticut, spent 8 years in Boston. She understood cities, the logic of streets and schedules, and the particular social ecosystem of people living in close quarters. But this was something else. The land out the window was enormous and indifferent in a way that felt almost personal. Flat plains giving way to foothills, foothills rising into ridges, ridges becoming mountains that wore permanent snow on their peaks like old men going gray. She arrived in Frost Hollow at 2:30 in the afternoon. The town was smaller than she'd expected, which was saying something because she hadn't expected much. One main street, 2 blocks long, with a general store, a saloon, a livery, a post office the size of a large closet, and a scattering of other buildings in varying states of structural confidence. A church with a crooked steeple. 24 houses behind the main strip. A mining operation visible up the hillside. A collection of machinery and shacks connected by muddy paths. Most of the people on the street stopped to watch the stage arrive. Evelyn stepped down with her tied-up suitcase and stood in the cold air and looked around. A man detached himself from the shadow of the general store's porch and walked toward her. She recognized him from the way he moved, with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had learned long ago that rushing rarely improved any situation. He was taller than she'd pictured, with broader shoulders. He wore a heavy canvas coat gone dark with weather, and a hat that had clearly been reshaped by years of hard use. He stopped about 5 feet from her and looked at her in a way that was direct without being rude, like a man assessing a new situation, which is exactly what he was doing. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Vale." Up close, the scar on his face was more prominent than she'd imagined from the letter. He didn't try to hide it or angle away from it. It was just part of his face now, the way a knot in wood is just part of the wood. "How was the ride?" he asked. "Long," she said. "Cold." He nodded. He picked up her suitcase. The broken handle didn't seem to register with him, or if it did, he didn't mention it. And he said, "I have to get supplies before we head up. Shouldn't take long." That was when it started. They had gotten maybe 10 feet toward the general store when Aldous Pratt appeared in the doorway. A narrow, pink-faced man with the kind of smile that was never quite about what it appeared to be about. He looked at Gideon, then at Evelyn, then back at Gideon, and the smile widened into something with teeth in it. "Well," Pratt said, loud enough that the 3 people standing nearby could hear, "Gideon Vale went and actually did it." He shook his head like a man watching a dog try to do a trick. Ordered himself a woman off the page. His eyes moved up and down Evelyn like she was an item he was pricing. "What's she cost you? More or less than a good mule?" The men nearby thought this was funny. Evelyn felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the particular feeling of being publicly reduced to something less than a person. She had felt it in Boston, in courtrooms of public opinion, in every sideways glance from women who'd heard the story from someone who'd heard it from someone else. She was very, very tired of that feeling. But before she could formulate a response, before she could decide whether to be cold or sharp, or simply to walk past him like he hadn't spoken, Gideon stopped moving. He turned to face Pratt. The expression on his face was difficult to describe. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something quieter than anger, and considerably more dangerous. He said nothing for a moment. He just looked at Pratt with those flat, dark eyes until the smile on Pratt's face started to do something uncertain at the edges. Then Gideon said very quietly, "Aldous?" "What?" "She's my wife." A pause. "Say something like that again, and you can keep my business." The street was silent, not the comfortable silence of nothing happening, the compressed silence of people holding their breath. Pratt's face went through several phases, ending somewhere in the vicinity of a man who has overextended himself and knows it. "Now, Gideon, I didn't ask what you meant." Gideon picked up Evelyn's suitcase again. "I need 20 pounds of flour, salt pork, lamp oil, and a new set of trapping chain if you've got it. If you don't want my business, say so now." Pratt's jaw worked for a moment. "I've got all of it," he said. His voice had lost about half its volume. "Good." Gideon walked inside without another word. Evelyn followed him. She was careful not to let her hands shake until after the door was closed. They left Frost Hollow at 3:30, which didn't give them much light to work with. Gideon had a mule, a bad-tempered animal named in no way at all. He called it nothing, just made a particular sound when he needed it to move, and the mule carried the supplies and Evelyn's suitcase. Evelyn walked. She didn't complain about this. She'd assumed she would be walking. What she hadn't assumed was the mountain itself. The trail began gently enough, rising through a section of pine forest where the ground was at least level, and the trees offered some break from the wind. But within the first mile, the incline increased to something that made her thighs burn, and within 2 miles, she was stopping every few hundred yards to catch her breath in air that felt thin and sharp enough to cut. Gideon moved ahead of her at a measured pace. Occasionally he would pause without appearing to pause, stop to check the mule's load, or examine a section of the trail, always in a position that allowed her to close the gap without it being obvious he was waiting. She noticed this. She didn't say anything about it. The sun was hitting the western peaks and throwing everything into long, cold shadow when he stopped and pointed up, and to the right, where a dark shape was visible against the slope. "There," he said. The cabin was smaller than she'd hoped and larger than she'd feared. It was made of notched pine logs gone silver gray with age, with a roof that had clearly been repaired multiple times, and a stone chimney that looked solid. There was a woodpile along the south wall that must have contained 3 cords or more, split and stacked with a precision that somehow communicated more about the man who'd built it than any of the words in his letter had. 2 windows covered with oiled paper rather than glass, a heavy door with 3 iron hinges. Gideon pushed it open. The hinges were quiet, well maintained, she noted, the small detail of a man who lived alone and still kept things in order. Inside, a main room with the fireplace, a plank table, 2 chairs, a shelf of supplies. A sleeping area in the back, separated by a heavy curtain. A workbench covered in tools and trapping equipment, everything organized in a way that spoke of long habit. It smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and leather, and the particular smell of a space that had been lived in by one person for a very long time. Evelyn stood in the middle of it and tried to figure out what she felt. Not disappointed, exactly. She'd known what she was walking into, but there was a weight to the reality of it that the idea of it hadn't quite prepared her for. This was the whole of it, the whole geography of the life she'd chosen. These 4 walls, this mountain, this man with the ruined face and the careful eyes standing by the fireplace building a fire like she wasn't there. "Sleeping areas in the back," he said, without looking up from the fire. "Take the bed. I'll use the roll by the fireplace." "That's not fair to you." He glanced at her then. "We'll figure out the arrangements later. You've been on a coach for 2 days and you just climbed a mountain. Go sit down." She sat. He made a meal, not a good meal, not by any standards she'd been raised with, but a hot one. Salt pork fried in a pan with dried beans and hardtack. He put the plate in front of her without ceremony and sat across the table with his own plate, and they ate in the kind of gultens that had not yet learned to be comfortable. She was halfway through the plate when she realized she was ravenous. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten properly. Boston, days ago. A piece of bread and half an apple at the station. She finished everything on the plate. He refilled it without her asking. She looked up at him when he set it back down. He was already returning to his side of the table, like it was nothing, like it required no acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said. He made a sound that might have been, "You're welcome," and picked up his fork. Later, when she was in the back behind the curtain and could hear the wind working its way into the mountain with serious intent, she lay in the bed. A real bed, a rope frame with a thick mattress, the only piece of furniture in the cabin that showed any sign of care beyond bare functionality, and she thought about the day, about Pratt's face, about Gideon's voice when he'd said, "She's my wife." Not like a man claiming property, like a man drawing a line in the dirt and daring someone to step over it. She pulled the blanket tighter. It was the only warm blanket in the cabin. She'd see him take the thinner one out toward the fire. She had not expected that. She fell asleep faster than she had in months. The next morning, she woke before dawn to the sound of him moving around the main room. By the time she pushed through the curtain, already dressed, the fire was built up, and there was coffee on. Real coffee, not the thin gruel most frontier outposts seemed to consider adequate. He was standing at the workbench, working a section of trapping chain through his hands, checking each link. He wore no coat inside. The firelight showed the muscles in his forearms moving under the skin. "Coffee's on the right side of the stove," he said. "Handle of the pot runs hot. Don't grab it bare-handed." "Thank you." She found a tin cup on the shelf and poured carefully. The coffee was strong and very slightly bitter and exactly what she needed. She sat down at the table with it and watched him work and said, "We should talk about how this is going to function." He stopped, set down the chain, turned to look at her. All right. I want to be useful. I don't know how to do most of what needs doing up here, but I can learn. I'm not afraid of hard work. She wrapped both hands around the cup. I'm also not going to pretend this is something it isn't. We're strangers. We made a practical arrangement. I think we should be honest about that. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with his own coffee. He had a way of sitting that occupied space without sprawling. Contained, like a man who'd spent time in places where taking up too much room was a problem. Agreed, he said. What do you need most? In terms of help? He thought about it. Someone to keep the cabin maintained when I'm on the line. Fire stoked, food on, basic repairs when they come up. A pause. It's not complicated work, but it's constant. The altitude makes everything harder until you're used to it. How long does that take? Getting used to it. Weeks, maybe 2 months before you stop getting winded on the trail. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. You'll have headaches for the first week. That's the elevation, not sickness. Drink water, more than you think you need. What about you? She asked. What about me? What are your rules? The things that matter to you in terms of how we live here. He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. Outside, the wind was low. A baseline hum rather than the assault it had been the night before. I don't lie, he said finally. I expect the same. If something's wrong, say it. If something doesn't work, say that too. He looked at the table. I have bad nights sometimes. I don't mean... He stopped, started again. I'm not dangerous, but I can be difficult to be around when it happens. If you hear me in the night, leave it alone. Bad dreams? She asked. She kept her voice even. Something like that. I understand, she said. She didn't say anything more about it. He looked at her then with an expression she couldn't quite read, like he'd been prepared for a different response, a more probing one. No romance, she said, not unless that changes for both of us, and not until we know each other. Agreed. And you'll teach me what I need to know, without making me feel like a fool for not knowing it already. Something shifted in his face, not a smile, not quite, but adjacent to one. Fair. Good. She set her cup down. Where do we start? The first month was brutal and humiliating, and, in ways she hadn't anticipated, strangely clarifying. She burned the bread 4 times. The 4th time, she sat on the floor of the cabin and pressed her fingers against her eyes and said some words she'd learned from a sailor she once passed on the waterfront. Gideon was across the room, mending a section of canvas, and he didn't say anything, just stood up, went to the shelf, and came back and set a piece of hardtack down beside her. Bread's harder than it looks, he said. That's the most useless thing anyone has ever said to me. Probably. He went back to his mending. Try lower heat tomorrow. Frontier stoves run hot. She tried lower heat. The 5th loaf came out edible. He taught her to split wood the 2nd week, and this went badly before it went well. The axe was heavier than it looked, and the technique of it, the specific angle of the swing, the way you aim for the grain, the torque of the follow-through, was not intuitive. She bruised her palm badly on the 3rd day when her grip slipped and the axe handle struck her hand on the recovery. She wrapped it herself with cloth from her suitcase and didn't mention it until he noticed at supper. Let me see, he said. It's fine. Let me see, he said again, the same way, and she put her hand across the table. He unwrapped the cloth with a care she hadn't expected from those large, rough hands, examined the bruising, rewrapped it properly with a strip of the proper bandaging material from a tin box he kept under the workbench. Keep the grip loose until it heals, he said. You were holding too tight anyway. That's what caused it. When you grip hard, the handle shocks back up the wood into your hand. Loose grip, let the weight do the work. She practiced loose grip the next day. It helped. He taught her to track animals, or rather, he walked her through what he was reading in the snow, which she found so interesting that she stopped dreading the early morning line checks they began doing together twice a week. The way the land held information, the way an animal's path through snow told you about its size and gait and purpose. It was like learning to read a new language. What's that? She asked one morning, pointing to a set of prints heading down toward the frozen creek. He crouched beside them. Mink. Female. See how close the prints are? She's moving slow. Hunting, not running. Evelyn crouched beside him. Their shoulders were close. How do you know she's not running slow? Stride pattern. When they're in a hurry, minks bounce. 4 prints close together, then a gap. When they're hunting, it's more deliberate, like this. He traced the trail with one finger without touching the snow itself. She stopped here. He pointed to a place where the prints compressed and a faint impression of a crouched body was visible. Then went left, toward the bank. That's where the ice is thinner, easier access to the water underneath. Evelyn looked at the trail for a moment. She knows the ice is thin there. She's been working this section all winter. She has a territory. She does. They stood up. They walked back without speaking, but it was the first time the silence felt natural, like two people thinking the same direction rather than carefully avoiding each other. It was mid-December when the big storm arrived. Gideon knew it was coming 2 days before it did. He could read it in the barometric pressure he tracked with an old instrument on the cabin wall, in the particular quality of the cloud cover over the high peaks, in the way the animals on the trap line had gone quiet and still, in the way they did when something serious was incoming. We're going to be inside for at least 3 days, he told her that evening. Maybe 4. I need to pull the line before it hits. Check every trap, reset or close them, get back before the front arrives. I'll go with you. No. He said it without looking up from where he was packing his field kit. I can help. You'd slow me down. He said it flat, not unkind, just honest. I need to cover 6 miles fast. You're not ready for that pace in this terrain yet. I need you here. Keep the fire running, don't let it go below half, and if the storm hits before I'm back, stay inside and don't open the door. She didn't argue because he was right about the pace, and she was smart enough to know it. He was back in 4 hours, covered in ice crystals from collar to boot, moving faster than she'd seen him move. He stamped in through the door, dropped his pack, and immediately began stripping the outer layer. Storm's moving faster than I thought, he said. She'll hit by midnight. She hit at 10. By 11, the noise against the cabin walls was something that required revision of the concept of wind. It wasn't like weather, it was like an argument, like something with intent. Evelyn sat at the table with a book open in front of her that she wasn't reading, watching the walls flex. The fire was pulling hard against the draft. She could feel the cabin's temperature fluctuating as the storm found gaps in the chinking. Gideon checked the shutters, reworked the door seal with a strip of cloth, and added wood to the fire. He did all of this methodically, unhurried. By midnight, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped 15 degrees despite the fire. This is normal? Evelyn asked. For a serious storm, yes. He crouched by the fire, adding another split log. The cabin will hold. She's been through worse than this. I believe you, Evelyn said. I just want to make sure I'm believing the right things. A pause. Then, fair. By 1 in the morning, the fire was burning as hot as it would go, and the temperature was still dropping. Gideon got up, went to the chest at the foot of the sleeping area's bed, and came back with an armload of blankets, 2 heavier ones she hadn't seen before. We're going to have a problem, he said, setting them on the table. 1 fire isn't enough for both sides of the cabin in this cold. The sleeping area is going to be too cold to use. She understood what he was saying. All right, I'll sleep on my side of the fire. You take the other. We don't need to... He stopped, seemed to reconsider how he was framing this. It's the cold. That's all. I know. She took one of the heavy blankets. I'm not worried about it. They arranged themselves on opposite sides of the fireplace, backs to each other, wrapped in every blanket in the cabin. The floor was hard, and after about 20 minutes, Evelyn shifted to face the wall, which helped slightly with the noise, if nothing else. The storm continued its assault. After a while, she wasn't sure how long, she said to the wall in front of her quietly, because the storm made it somehow easier to say things in the dark. The man who ruined my life in Boston. He was a powerful man. He had friends in every office that mattered. A pause. Then, behind her, what happened? She told him. Not all of it, not the worst of it, but enough. The file room on a Thursday afternoon, the report to Victor Hale. The systematic destruction of her name by men who found it more convenient to call her a liar than to hold one of their own accountable. When she finished, the storm was the only sound for a moment. Then Gideon said, That's why you left. That's why I had nowhere left to go, she said, which is slightly different. Yeah, he said quietly. It is. More silence. The fire crackled. The wind shrieked and retreated and shrieked again. The war, she said carefully. Is that? Yeah, just the one word. You don't have to. I know. A pause. Not tonight. All right. She listened to him breathe behind her, slow and steady, the way a man who has trained himself to sleep anywhere sleeps. Not peacefully exactly, but functionally. Present, not gone. She realized she was no longer listening primarily to the storm. She fell asleep somewhere in the small hours, back against the warmth radiating from his side of the fire, surrounded by the sound of a mountain trying and failing to get inside. She woke to silence. The storm had passed somewhere before dawn. The light through the oiled paper windows was white and absolute, the way it got after heavy snowfall. The world reduced to its bones, stripped clean, everything covered. Gideon was already up. She could smell coffee. She pushed herself upright from the floor, her back protesting the night's arrangement, and pushed through the curtain into the main room. He was at the workbench, working on a trap spring by the light from the front window. 2 cups of coffee sat on the table. He'd made her a cup before she was awake. It was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing, but she stood there with the curtain still in her hand and felt something in her chest do a slow shift, like furniture being moved in a room that had been arranged the same way for a long time. She sat down. She wrapped her hands around the cup. Back okay? He asked, not looking up from the trap. Manageable. Floor's not forgiving. No, she agreed. But I'm alive, and the cabin is still standing. He looked up at that. The morning light caught the scar on his face, and he looked for a second like what he was. A man who had survived a remarkable number of things and was still working out what to do with the fact. Yeah, he said. Both of those things. She drank her coffee. He worked on his trap spring. The snow outside lay deep and silent, and the sky beyond the window was the particular electric blue of high-altitude mornings after a storm, the kind of color that seems too vivid to be real. It was, she thought, an unexpectedly livable morning. Not beautiful, not the way that word usually meant, but real, solid. The kind of morning where nothing was pretending to be anything else. She thought, this might be enough. She didn't know yet what enough would grow into, but it was, for now, a place to stand. The days after the storm were the kind of quiet that felt earned. The mountains sat under 3 feet of new snow, and the world contracted to whatever distance a man could see from his own front door. Gideon went out the morning after to dig the path clear between the cabin and the woodpile, a job that took the better part of 2 hours. And Evelyn watched him from the window while she worked through the breakfast dishes, and she thought about what he'd said the night before when she'd told him about Boston. He hadn't said, "I'm sorry." He hadn't said that must have been terrible in the way people say things like that when they want the conversation to move on to something more comfortable. He just said yeah and sat with it, and that had been, somehow, the most useful response anyone had given her in a very long time. She dried the last tin cup and put it on the shelf and went outside to help him clear the second half of the path, and he didn't tell her to go back inside. That was December. By January, they had developed the rhythms of people who share a small space, not easily, not without friction, but with a kind of negotiated practicality that was its own form of respect. She learned which silences were comfortable and which ones meant he was somewhere else in his head, working through something she didn't have access to. He learned that she needed an hour of quiet in the early morning before she was ready to be spoken to, and that this was not unfriendliness, but simply the way she was built. He started making 2 cups of coffee before he said anything to her at all. She started leaving his side of the workbench exactly as she found it, because she'd moved a set of trap springs once and watched something tighten in his jaw and understood without being told that the organization of that space was not random. They did not talk about their arrangement. They had agreed to it, and both of them were people who understood that a thing agreed upon didn't need to be continuously re-examined. But things were changing, the way water changes rock, too slowly to observe directly, only apparent when you look back at where you started. It was a Tuesday in late January when she burned the bread again. Not through negligence this time. A knot in the firewood had caused a sudden flare in the stove that brought the temperature up fast while her attention was on the mending she'd been doing at the table. She pulled the loaf out and looked at the blackened bottom and felt the particular, disproportionate frustration of a person who has been working hard at something and still cannot get it right. She set the pan down on the stovetop with more force than she needed to. "Still salvageable," Gideon said from the doorway. He'd come in from the afternoon line check and was still wearing his outer coat, snow melting off the shoulders. He set his pack against the wall and walked over and broke off the blackened part and tasted the rest. Bottom's bad. Inside's fine. I know what salvageable means, she said. Her voice had an edge in it that she didn't entirely try to remove. He looked at her for a moment. I wasn't criticizing. I know. She sat down at the table, pressed her hands flat on the wood. I know you weren't. I'm angry at myself, not at you. He hung up his coat. What else? She looked up. What? You don't get that kind of angry about bread. What else? She was quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove made its small domestic sounds. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Not storm level, just the usual background aggression of the mountain in January. I don't know how to do nothing, she said finally. In Boston, there was always work. Documents to file, letters to draft, always something that needed doing. Here, I finished the cabin work by mid-afternoon, and then there's just... She gestured at the walls. I'm not complaining about this place. I chose it. But I don't know yet how to be still. Gideon pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at his hands for a moment. I can teach you to read the trapline charts, he said. Keep the records. Right now I keep them in my head, which works until it doesn't. A pause. There's also a stretch of the eastern line that needs resetting. 3 locations where the terrain changed after last year's spring flood. I've been working around it. You could map it with me. It'll take a week going out in sections. She looked at him. You've been working around a problem on your trapline for a year. 8 months. Because you didn't have help to fix it. He said nothing. Which was, she was learning, the same as yes. All right, she said. Show me the charts after supper. He nodded. He got up and cut 2 slices from the center of the bread, the good part, and put them on the table with the salt pork he'd reheated, and they ate with the charts spread between them, and he walked her through the system he'd built over 11 years of working the same terrain. She was a fast learner. He'd understood that from the tracking lessons, but the charts confirmed it. She asked questions that cut to the functional center of a problem, the way a person does when they're not performing interest but actually feeling it. By the time they put the lamp out, she had sketched her own version of the eastern section from his descriptions, and it was, he noted, more readable than his own. He didn't say that, but she saw him look at it twice. The Eastern Line project started the following week. They went out in the early mornings while the light was good, moving through sections of terrain that she was, by now, starting to feel in her body. The specific muscle memory of these particular slopes, these creek crossings, the way this ridge's ice behaved differently from the one to the south. She stopped getting winded by the 3rd week of January. By February, she could keep pace with him on terrain that wasn't technical. They talked more on the trail than they did in the cabin. She wasn't sure why that was. Something about moving, maybe, the way conversations come easier when you're not sitting across from each other with your full attention available for eye contact. They talked about practical things mostly. The trapline, the weather patterns. What she was figuring out about frontier cooking, which was mostly that every recipe she'd ever known required a total revision for altitude and available ingredients. But sometimes it was other things. You grew up in Connecticut? He asked one morning, watching her sketch a section of creek bed in the small notebook she'd started carrying. Hartfield, small town. My father ran a hardware store. She finished the sketch. My mother died when I was 12. After that, it was just the 2 of us until I left at 21. Why Boston? Because it was the largest city I could reach on what I had. I wanted... She stopped, thought about how to say it. I wanted to be somewhere that had more than one answer. Hartfield only ever had one answer to everything. He made a sound of understanding. What about you? She said. Before the mountain. The pause was longer than usual. He was checking a set of prints in the snow, crouching with his elbows on his knees. Pennsylvania. Small farm, 3 brothers. My father was a hard man. Not mean, just hard. The kind of man who believed suffering was instructive. Was it? Taught me to be very good at suffering, he said. Whether that was worth the education is a separate question. He stood up. Enlisted at 22, the war was... He stopped. You know what the war was. Everybody knows what the war was. I know what people said about it afterward, she said carefully. From newspapers. I don't know what it was to be inside it. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the creek bed. It was a long time spent watching people you knew become people you couldn't recognize. He said it evenly, the way you say a thing when you've gotten to the bottom of it and found there's nothing left to protect, including yourself. She didn't say anything. She wrote a notation in her notebook and they walked on, and after a while he began talking about the trapline again. And she let him and understood that what he'd just said had cost him something and that the best response was to treat it normally. The eastern line took 10 days to remap fully. When they were done, she had a complete chart of the section, corrected for the terrain changes, with trap locations, water sources, and what she'd started annotating as wildlife pressure points, areas where the animal activity was highest and the traps would likely need checking more frequently. He looked at the finished chart for a long time. "This is better than what I had," he said. "You had nothing written down at all for this section." "I know." He set the chart on the shelf where he kept the others. "Thank you. I'll start on the western section next week if the weather allows." He turned and looked at her with an expression she couldn't categorize, something between evaluation and something softer, something that seemed to be reconsidering a prior conclusion. "All right," he said. She went back to her mending. He stood by the shelf a moment longer than necessary, then went to the workbench. February moved through the mountains slowly, as it always did. There were bad nights. Not many, but they happened, the way he'd warned her they would. She'd be sleeping and hear him across the cabin, not screaming, nothing so dramatic as that, but a particular tight sound of a man trapped somewhere he couldn't get out of. She lay still and kept her breathing even, the way he'd asked, and after a while the sounds would stop and she'd hear him stoke the fire and move around quietly until whatever had been in his head settled back down. The first time it happened, she'd almost gone to him. She'd sat up in the dark behind the curtain with her hand on the fabric and held herself still through a kind of effort she hadn't expected. Not because he'd asked her to leave it alone, though he had, but because she understood, from her own experience of nights in Boston when everything had crashed down at once, that there was a kind of comfort in being left alone to find your own way back. Having someone hover over you in those moments didn't help. It only added the obligation of performing recovery for their benefit. So she stayed still. She let him be. And in the morning he was always already up, coffee made, working on something at the bench, and she would come through the curtain and take her cup and sit at the table, and that would be the whole of it. No mention. No checking in, just the resumption of the ordinary, which was its own kind of reassurance. She was learning his language. He was learning hers. The warmth she'd started feeling for him was inconvenient, and she knew it. They'd agreed to something specific, and she was not a person who moved the goalposts without acknowledgement. But it was hard to live close to someone, genuinely close, the kind of close where you know how they take their coffee, and which particular silence means they're working through something difficult, and stay entirely neutral about them. She didn't try to do anything with it. She just noted it, the way you note a shift in weather, and kept moving. It was the middle of February when she finally managed a full loaf of bread that came out right. Not just edible, actually right, with a proper crust and a soft center, and the smell of it filling the cabin for an hour before supper. She cut 2 slices and put them on the table. Said nothing. He picked up the slice and ate it and looked at the table for a moment and then looked at her. "That's good," he said, like it was a simple fact. It probably was a simple fact to him. For her it landed like something considerably larger, not because of the bread itself, but because she'd started this winter not knowing how to do anything up here, and she was starting to do things. Real things. Things that mattered to the actual business of surviving in this place. "I've been working on the sourdough starter," she said, fighting the urge to make more of the moment than it was. "I noticed." He ate the rest of the slice. "What changed?" "Less heat, like you said the first time. And I've been keeping the starter warmer. I moved it to the shelf above the stove instead of beside it. It's more active now." He nodded slowly. "Good thinking." They ate the rest of supper. Later that night, when the lamps were down and the fire was the only light in the cabin, she was almost asleep behind the curtain when she heard him say, from the other side, quietly, not loud enough to wake her if she'd been fully asleep, "My brother's name was Thomas." She lay still. He was 20 when he died, Fredericksburg. He'd only been in the regiment 6 weeks. A pause. "I was the one who suggested he enlist. Thought it would be good for him. He was soft. Not weak, just gentle." The kind of person who shouldn't have been anywhere near a war. His voice was flat and low, the voice of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and is setting it down in the only way he knows how, carefully, in the dark, with someone he trusts enough to let hear the sound of it. I got out. He didn't. I've been trying to figure out what to do with that for about 20 years. Evelyn lay perfectly still. After a moment, she said quietly, I don't think there's anything to figure out. I think it's just something you carry. Silence. Yeah, he said. I know. I'm sorry about Thomas, she said. Another silence. Then, thank you. The fire burned down. They slept. Outside, the mountain did what it always did. Held its position, indifferent to the small, warm lives sheltered against its flank, while the winter stars wheeled overhead in their enormous cold arcs. And in the cabin, something that had been frozen for a long time was very slowly, at the edges, beginning to melt. Neither of them would have called it that. Neither of them was ready to name it yet. But it was there, the way heat is there in embers long after the visible flame has gone, quiet, persistent, waiting for the right conditions to become something you couldn't ignore. The month turned. The cold held. They kept working and talking and surviving, and doing the 100 small things that people do when they are building, whether they know it or not, the specific architecture of a life shared. March arrived the way it always did on Frost Hollow Ridge, not as a relief, but as a negotiation. The worst of the cold began to loosen its grip, degree by stubborn degree, and the snowpack on the southern slopes started showing the first gray edges of melt. The days got longer by minutes at a time, and those minutes mattered. They changed the quality of the light coming through the oiled paper windows, made the cabin feel less like a bunker and more like a place where people actually chose to live. Evelyn noticed it first in the mornings. The darkness didn't press down quite as hard when she woke. She could hear, on the still days, water moving somewhere under the snow on the eastern slope, a sound she hadn't heard since she arrived, thin and distant, but real. She'd been on the mountain 4 months. She was not the same person who had stepped off that stagecoach in Frost Hollow with a broken-handled suitcase and a carefully maintained expression of composure. That woman had known how to survive a city, how to navigate offices and social hierarchies and the particular cruelties of respectable society. This version of her knew different things. She knew how to keep a fire alive through a 3-day storm. She knew how to read a creek bed for animal sign, how to resole a boot with leather cut from a scrap hide, how to identify the specific quality of silence that meant weather was building over the high peaks. She was also, for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, not afraid. Not of the mountain, not of the isolation, not of the man she shared the cabin with. She wasn't sure exactly when that had shifted. It hadn't been a single moment, more like the accumulation of 100 small things. The way he'd wrapped her bruised hand without making a production of it. The way he'd made her coffee before she was awake. The way he'd said Thomas in the dark like he was finally setting something down. She thought about what she'd told him through the storm in December. About Boston. About Victor Hale and what he'd allowed to happen. About the systematic way her name had been taken apart and reassembled into something unrecognizable. She hadn't told that story to anyone completely. Not her father, not the women she'd thought were friends, not the one lawyer she'd consulted who'd listened with a face full of professional sympathy before explaining that there was nothing actionable in her situation. Gideon hadn't offered sympathy exactly. He'd offered belief, which was a different thing and considerably rarer. She was thinking about this on a Thursday morning in mid-March when he came in from checking the upper line and set his pack down with a different energy than usual. Not urgency, exactly, but the specific focus he got when something had his full attention. "Grizzly sign on the upper eastern section," he said, pulling off his outer coat. She looked up from the charts she'd been updating. "How recent?" "This morning." He poured himself coffee, stood at the stove with the cup. "She's out of Denning early. The warm spell last week probably pulled her up. She's been working the creek beds, looking for anything that didn't make it through the winter." He drank. "She came within about 100 yards of the trap on the north bend, followed the scent line." "Will she come back?" "If she found anything worth coming back for." He set the cup down. "I need to pull that section of line for a while. Grizzly gets into traps. She'll destroy everything and potentially get hurt doing it, which makes her dangerous to anything in the area." He looked at her steadily. I also need you to stop going out east alone until I know where she's ranging. Evelyn set down her pen. She understood the instruction was practical, not protective in the patronizing sense. What about the Western mapping? I was going to finish the last section this week. Western's fine. She's east of the ridge. Just don't cross the ridge without me. All right. I mean it, Evelyn. The use of her first name was not common. They'd maintained a certain formality about names, as if first names required a permission neither had explicitly given yet. She registered the shift. I understand, she said. I'm not going to argue with you about a grizzly. He nodded, satisfied, and went to the workbench. She went back to the charts, but she could feel him behind her, still thinking, and after a while he said, When I was coming back down the ridge, I found where she'd been yesterday. Dug out a section of the creek bank. She's thorough. Big? Very. Track's about 10 inches across. He paused. Old female. Probably been working this territory for 15 years. She was here before I was. There was something in his voice when he said that. Not admiration exactly, but a kind of recognition. One creature who'd been on this mountain a long time acknowledging another. For the next 2 weeks, she stayed west of the ridge. She finished the mapping, worked on the cabin's chinking where the winter storms had loosened it, and started on a project she'd been thinking about since January. Reinforcing the storage shelves, which had been built with a casualness that didn't account for the weight of a full winter's supplies. She pulled them apart and rebuilt them using techniques Gideon had shown her for joinery, working in the afternoons when the light was good. He came home on a Wednesday to find her halfway through the job, the main room rearranged around it, supplies stacked on the table. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. The left bracket on the upper shelf was splitting, she said, not looking up from where she was fitting a new support. If it had gone with a full load on it, we'd have lost a season's worth of salt pork. He walked in and crouched beside her to look at the joint she was working. Where'd you learn the wedge method? You showed me. In November, when we fixed the mule's pack frame. A pause. I did. You didn't think I was paying attention. I thought you were cold and wanted to go inside. She glanced at him. I was cold and wanted to go inside. I was also paying attention. He made a sound that was close enough to a laugh that she countered it. He held the bracket while she drove the wedge, and they worked together in the late afternoon light until the shelves were solid again and the supplies were back in place. Over supper, she'd made a proper stew that night, with the dried vegetables she'd been rationing and the last of the salt pork, and it was genuinely good. He said, I want to tell you something about the war. She set down her spoon. He was looking at the table, turning his cup in his hands. He did that when he was working up to something, she'd learned. The cup turning was a physical version of the verbal pauses, a way of giving himself time. There was a man in my regiment named Cowboy, he said. He and I went through most of it together, 2 years. He was from Ohio, funny man, the kind of person who could make something into a joke in a way that didn't feel like a denial of how bad things were. He stopped. Gettysburg, 3rd day. I got separated from the regiment in the advance. I was down, not badly hit, concussion from a shell burst. I could hear, but I couldn't get my legs under me. His jaw tightened slightly. Calloway came back for me, under fire, dragged me about 40 yards to a depression in the ground, and held position until I could move. He stopped again. He died 2 months later, dysentery, not even combat, in a field hospital that smelled like... He stopped. It didn't matter how. He was gone. And I kept thinking afterward that he came back for me and then died anyway. And if he hadn't come back, he'd probably have lived. He looked up. That's the kind of math the war leaves you with, the kind you can't work your way out of. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then... Did he know? What he was doing, going back for you? Of course he knew. Then he made a choice, she said. That was his to make, not yours to carry. I know that's true, Gideon said. Knowing it and feeling it are different things. Yes. She picked up her spoon again. They are. He looked at her. I know that the assault in the file room wasn't my fault, she said evenly. I have known that from the first moment. That has never once stopped it from feeling like something I should have been able to prevent. She met his eyes. Knowing doesn't fix it, but telling someone... She stopped, looked back at her bowl. Sometimes that helps. A little. The fire was the only sound for a moment. Yeah, he said quietly. It does. They finished supper. She washed the bowls. He went to the workbench. The lamp burned low, and neither of them spoke again that night, but the silence had a different texture now. Warmer, somehow. Earned. The grizzly came into contact with Evelyn's life on a Saturday in the last week of March, in a way that Gideon had specifically told her to prevent, and that happened anyway through a sequence of small, compounding misjudgments that she would replay an exact sequence for years afterward. It started with a rabbit. She'd gone west to check a small snare she'd set on her own initiative. Not on the main trapline, just a personal experiment on a game trail she'd identified 50 yards from the cabin's clearing. It was barely inside the western boundary Gideon had established, and she'd told herself this clearly enough to proceed. The snare had a large snowshoe hair in it, and she'd crouched to deal with it the way Gideon had shown her. She heard it before she processed what she was hearing, a sound like something very large moving through brush with no particular urgency. The sound of something that had no reason to move quietly because nothing in its world threatened it. She looked up. The grizzly was at the edge of the tree line, maybe 60 feet away, and she was enormous. Gideon had said 10-inch track, but the physical reality of the animal was a different category of information than the measurement. She was brown-black and winter-thin, but still the largest living thing Evelyn had ever been within 100 yards of, and she was looking at Evelyn with the alert, assessing attention of an animal who has encountered something unexpected and is deciding what to do about it. Evelyn did not move. She was crouched with the dead rabbit in her hands, and she did not move and she did not breathe, and her entire nervous system was doing something that had nothing to do with rational thought. The bear took 2 steps toward her, stopped, lifted her head, and sampled the air. Later, much later, Evelyn would understand that the bear had almost certainly not been going to charge. She was investigating. She was old and experienced, and old, experienced grizzlies do not generally charge at crouching humans who are not threatening them. This was information Evelyn did not have access to in that particular moment. What she had access to was panic, and the panic told her legs to move. She stood up. The bear's head dropped, a response to the sudden movement, the posture shifting, and Evelyn ran. She ran the wrong direction. She understood this immediately and could not correct it. The cabin was north, she'd run east, and the terrain that way dropped off toward the creek bed, and her boot caught a root under the snow, and she went down hard, catching herself on her hands, one palm driving into a rock hidden beneath the powder. She heard the bear behind her, heavy footfalls, branches snapping. She got to her feet and turned, back against a pine trunk, and the bear was 30 feet away and closing at a run. Not a full charge, still assessing, but 30 feet and coming fast was 30 feet and coming fast regardless of its intention. Then Gideon was there. She didn't see where he'd come from. He was simply there, between her and the bear, empty-handed for one impossible second before he grabbed a fallen pine branch off the snow, a heavy one, 3 inches thick, and he brought it down hard against the trunk of the nearest tree, a crack like a rifle shot. The bear stopped. He did it again and shouted, a short, hard bark of sound, nothing like a word, just volume. And he was big, she understood in that fractured moment. He was actually large, and he stood like something that had decided on its position and wasn't open to discussion about it. The bear swung her head, huffed, took 1 step sideways. Back, Gideon said. Quietly now. Not to Evelyn, to the bear. The bear huffed again and turned and moved back toward the tree line, not fleeing, just withdrawing, with the insulted dignity of something that has decided the situation isn't worth its time. She went into the trees and was gone. The branch hit the snow. Gideon turned around. Evelyn was pressed against the pine trunk with both hands over her mouth, and she was shaking. Not small shaking, full body, uncontrollable, the physiological aftermath of the kind of fear that bypasses everything rational and goes straight to the animal. Gideon covered the distance between them in 4 strides, and his hands went to her face, one on each side, the way you steady something that's going to fall. Hey, he said, low, direct. Hey, look at me. She looked at him. You're all right, he said. She's gone. You're all right. I ran, Evelyn said. Her voice came out wrong, too thin. You told me not to run. I know. I ran and then I went the wrong direction, and I fell. Evelyn. His hands were still on her face. His thumbs were cold against her cheekbones. You're all right, That's the only thing that matters right now. She wasn't sure how long they stood like that. Long enough for her breathing to slow. Long enough for the shaking to come down from full body to just her hands. She became aware of the blood. Her right palm, where she'd caught herself on the rock. A clean cut, not deep, but producing more blood than a surface wound usually justified because her hands were cold and the blood wasn't clotting quickly. He saw it at the same moment she did. "Cabin," he said. Just that. She didn't argue. He walked beside her the whole way, not behind her, not ahead. Beside, close enough that his arm occasionally pressed against hers. He didn't hold her hand. He didn't put his arm around her. He just stayed beside her. At the cabin, he dealt with the cut the way he dealt with everything physical, competently and without drama. Clean cloth, cold water from the bucket, a wrap that was firm without being tight. She sat at the table and watched him work, and her hands had stopped shaking, but the feeling in her chest was still unsettled, a compound thing that she couldn't immediately sort into its component parts. When he finished, he kept his hands around hers for a moment, not examining, just holding. Then he let go and stood and went to the stove to put water on. "I should have stayed west," she said. Yes. He didn't say it harshly, just as fact. The snare was inside the boundary, barely. Barely still counts. He turned from the stove. "I'm not angry. I want to be clear about that. What just happened?" He stopped. Something moved through his face that she hadn't seen there before. Something that had briefly lost its composure and was being carefully reordered. "I came down from the upper line and I heard her moving in that direction, and I knew." He looked at the window. "I ran the last quarter mile." She heard what he wasn't saying, the weight of it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to I know." He turned back to the stove. "I know you didn't." He made tea, the good kind she'd brought from Frost Hollow on the last supply run, which he normally left alone because he knew she rationed it. He made it without asking and set it in front of her and sat across the table with his own cup of coffee. And they sat that way while the afternoon light slid down the cabin walls and the fire popped and the mountain held its enormous silence outside. "I need to tell you the rest," Evelyn said eventually. "About Boston. About Victor Hale specifically." He looked at her. Waited. Dwight Colburn, the man who assaulted me, was Hale's business partner, but Hale was also something else to him. They had arrangements, financial arrangements that weren't legal. She looked at her tea. "When I came forward, I wasn't just threatening Colburn's reputation. I was threatening to draw attention to the whole structure. That's why Hale moved so fast. That's why it was so thorough." Gideon's expression had gone still. "He has money and influence across half the eastern seaboard," she continued. "When I left Boston, I was reasonably certain no one would bother following me. I was no one by then. No job, no standing, no credibility. There was nothing to gain by finding me." She paused. "I still believe that's probably true, but I wanted you to know the whole of it." Silence. "Because you've told me the whole of things," she said, "and I owed you the same." Gideon turned his cup in his hands. She recognized the gesture. "This Hale," he said, "if he decided you mattered, if something changed." "He has lawyers and hired men and a reputation to protect," she said. "I have nothing he needs to fear." "You have a story," Gideon said. "Stories matter, when they're the right story at the right time." She hadn't thought of it that way. She looked at him. "I'm not saying he'll come," Gideon said. "I'm saying, if he does." He set his cup down, and when he looked at her, his voice was flat and completely certain, the way it had been when he'd stood between her and the bear. "No one will hurt you again. I won't let that happen." It was not a romantic declaration. It was not said with softness or sentiment. It was said the way a man states a fact he has already decided is true and is simply making it available for her information. She believed him, not because he was large or capable, though he was both, because she had spent 4 months watching him keep his word on everything he'd said he would do, small and large, and she understood that this was a man whose promises were not decorative. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, picked up his cup. Outside, the March light was fading, the shadows going blue across the snow. Somewhere east of the ridge, an old female grizzly was moving through her territory, doing what she'd been doing for 15 years, knowing every inch of this mountain the way only time can teach you a place. And in the cabin, two people who had each survived the particular violence of a world that had tried to reduce them to less than they were sat across from each other in the firelight, and the thing growing between them had passed some invisible threshold that neither of them was quite ready to name. But it was there. It had weight. It had history now. And that night, when the lamp was out and the fire had burned to its steady red core, Gideon crossed the cabin quietly, sat in the chair beside the hearth where she'd fallen asleep reading, and placed one hand briefly, carefully, on her hair. She was asleep. She didn't feel it. He went back to his side of the fire, but he sat awake for a long time, watching the embers, thinking about a woman who'd run toward a grizzly's territory with a dead rabbit in her hands, and a life she was still learning how to live. And he felt something in the place where Thomas used to live, that cold, familiar hollow, begin, very slowly, to fill with something other than grief. April came in sideways, the way spring always did at elevation. 2 warm days followed by a cold snap that made you feel like an idiot for believing in the first 2 days. Then grudging warmth again, incremental, unreliable. The snowpack retreated from the southern slopes in patches. The creek below the eastern ridge started running properly. Not the thin trickle under ice from March, but actual water moving over actual rock, loud enough to hear from the cabin door on still mornings. Evelyn's palm had healed clean. She had gone back to the snare location 3 days after the encounter with the bear, alone, on purpose, because she needed to know she could. She'd checked the snare, reset it, and walked back without incident. She hadn't told Gideon she'd done it. When he noticed she'd been out, he always noticed. He read the state of the cabin and her boots and her coat the way he read the snow. He looked at her for a moment and said nothing. She thought that was probably its own kind of acknowledgement. The trapline was shifting into its spring configuration, which meant fewer fur-bearing animals but better tracking conditions as the snow consolidated. Gideon spent more time working the high elevations now, chasing the snowshoe hares that moved upslope as the lower terrain softened. He was gone longer hours, sometimes not back until an hour after dark. She'd stopped worrying about this, not because she'd decided it was fine to not worry, but because she'd learned that the mountain had its own logic and he understood it, and her worrying didn't change either of those things. She kept supper warm and kept the lamp on, and he came back when he came back. On a Friday evening in the second week of April, he came back earlier than usual, moving faster than his normal pace. She heard him on the trail before she saw him. The specific rhythm of his footsteps was familiar to her now, the way people who live close to each other absorb the details of how the other person occupies space. She opened the door before he reached it. He came in and set his pack down and straightened, and she could see immediately that something was wrong. Not fear. Gideon didn't carry fear in any visible way, but a particular quality of alertness, the kind that preceded action. "What happened?" she asked. "Supply rider came up the east trail today while I was working the upper section. He flagged me down." He pulled off his coat. Rider out of Frost Hollow, passed through a man on the road 2 miles south of town, well-dressed, Eastern clothes, hired horse, not his own, asking directions to the Vale property. The cold that moved through Evelyn had nothing to do with the temperature in the cabin. "Description?" she asked. Her voice came out steady. She was distantly proud of that. Tall, dark coat, good boots. Gideon looked at her. Mean face was how the rider put it. Polite mouth, mean face. Victor Hale. She sat down at the table. Not because she needed to sit, but because she needed to do something with her body while her mind recalibrated. She had spent 5 months believing, needing to believe, that she was too far gone, too thoroughly ruined and discarded for anyone from her old life to bother following. She had built the logic of her safety on that foundation. The foundation had just developed a crack. "It might not be him," she said. Gideon sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. "It might be someone else entirely. A land buyer, a mining solicitor." "Might be," he said. He said it in a way that meant they both knew it wasn't. She pressed her fingers against the table. "He has no legal claim on me. There was nothing binding between us. He can't make me go anywhere." "No," Gideon said. "He can't, but he doesn't need a legal claim. He has money, and he has men he can hire, and he has the kind of patience that comes from never having been told no permanently." She looked up. "When I left Boston, I heard through a woman I trusted that he'd been asking about me. I told myself it was residual, that he'd stop. He didn't stop. Apparently not. She was quiet for a moment. He doesn't want me back out of sentiment. I want to be clear about that. He wants me back because I'm a loose end, because I know about the arrangements between him and Colburn, and as long as I'm alive and free somewhere, I'm a potential problem. Gideon was very still in the way he got when he was thinking through a situation completely. He'll come to the cabin, he said. It wasn't a question. If that's where the trail leads, yes. Then we wait. She looked at him. That's your plan? We don't run. This is our ground. He said "our" without any indication that the word required emphasis. He comes here, he deals with me before he deals with you. That's how it works. She wanted to argue. She found she didn't have an argument that held against the flat certainty in his voice. He'll have something ready, she said. A story. Documentation, maybe. He's careful that way. I don't care about his documentation. Gideon, I don't care, he repeated calmly. He can have papers signed by every judge in the territory. None of that matters on this mountain. She understood what he meant. She wasn't sure whether to be comforted or frightened by it. She settled on both. They spent that evening quietly, without the comfortable rhythm the last few months had developed. She mended. He sharpened tools at the workbench. The lamp threw its usual steady light, but underneath the ordinary surface of it, both of them were somewhere else, listening for something on the trail below, watching the door. Victor Hale arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, 9 days later. Evelyn was outside splitting wood. She'd gotten genuinely good at this, her technique solid now, the work efficient, when she heard the horse on the lower trail. She set the axe into the chopping block and turned, and she knew it was him before she could see the face, because she recognized the way he sat, a horse. Victor Hale sat like a man who'd hired someone else to teach him how, and had learned correctly without ever learning naturally. He came into the clearing and stopped the horse and looked down at her. He was exactly as she remembered. 48 years old, lean, with the kind of features that photographed well and in person communicated something colder than photographs managed to capture. He wore a dark coat that was wrong for the terrain, expensive wool, not canvas, the kind of coat that said he hadn't expected the mountains to be a real consideration, just a backdrop. Evelyn, he said. He said her name like a document heading. Mr. Hale. She didn't move from where she stood. The axe was in the block 2 feet behind her. She didn't reach for it. You're looking well, he said, all things considered. His eyes moved over the cabin, the woodpile, the clearing. Assessment. Everything was always assessment with him. This is quite remote. That was the idea. He dismounted and tied the horse to a post at the clearing's edge. He straightened his coat. He walked toward her with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 40 years learning to occupy rooms in a way that made other people feel like guests in spaces they owned. I think you know why I'm here, he said. I don't actually, she said. We have nothing between us. We never did. You have information that belongs in the past, he said. I'm prepared to offer you something significant to formalize that understanding. I have a document that simply states, no. He paused. You haven't heard... I don't need to hear the number, she said. The answer is no. Something moved through his expression. Not anger. Victor Hale didn't do anger in visible ways. It was more like the adjustment of a calculation. Evelyn, I've come a very long distance. I think you might want to consider what the alternative. She said no. Gideon stepped out of the cabin door. He'd been inside when she'd heard the horse. He'd heard it too, she understood now, and he'd stayed inside, giving her the choice of how to handle the opening. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then came down the 2 steps into the clearing, and he walked toward them at his normal pace, which was unhurried and direct and somehow more intimidating than a run would have been. Hale looked at him. She watched him recalibrate, taking in the size, the scar, the way Gideon moved across this ground like he'd grown from it. You must be the husband, Hale said. He managed to put a slight inflection on husband that questioned its legitimacy without quite stating the question. Gideon Vale. He stopped about 6 feet from Hale. And you're trespassing. Hale smiled. It didn't reach anything above his jaw. Mr. Vale, I have no quarrel with you. This is a matter between myself and your wife regarding a prior. There's no prior, Gideon said. Whatever was between you and her in Boston is done. She's here. She's mine. And you don't speak to her about anything without going through me first. The word mine landed in the air between them. Evelyn noted from some removed and analytical part of herself that it didn't feel reductive. It felt like a wall being placed between her and something dangerous. Hale's jaw tightened slightly. He looked at Evelyn. I'm prepared to be generous. Whatever difficulties arose from the situation with Mr. Colburn, and I understand those were real difficulties, Evelyn. I've always understood that. Gideon moved. Not fast, not theatrical. He simply covered the distance between himself and Hale in 2 long strides and took Hale's lapel in one hand and walked him backward until Hale's back was against the post where his horse was tied, and the horse shied and pulled at the rope, and Hale's expensive coat was bunched in a fist. Don't say her name again, Gideon said. Low, completely level. Hale's composure had fractured. There was something underneath it now. The authentic version of him, the one the composure was built to conceal, which was smaller and more frightened than the exterior suggested. I have legal... I don't care. Gideon released him, stepped back. Get on your horse. Hale straightened his coat. The action was automatic. Restore the surface. Restore the control. You're making a significant mistake, he said. His voice had recovered some of its steadiness. I have resources you cannot match. You have a horse and a long road back to town. Gideon's voice had not changed in pitch or temperature. Right away now, while you still can. I'll return with the law, Hale said. I'll have documentation that... Ride, Gideon said, just the one word. The silence that followed was about 10 seconds long. 10 seconds during which Victor Hale stood against the post and looked at Gideon Vale and conducted whatever internal reckoning a man like him conducts when his usual tools have stopped working. His money was in Boston. His lawyers were in Boston. His hired men, if he had any, were presumably in Frost Hollow. He was alone on a mountain with a man who was not afraid of him, and that was a situation none of his 48 years of careful accumulation had prepared him for. He untied his horse. He mounted without looking at either of them. This isn't finished, he said from the saddle. Gideon said nothing. Hale rode out of the clearing at a controlled pace, not fleeing. He would never flee. He would always maintain the performance of control, and disappeared down the lower trail. The clearing was quiet. The horse tied at the other post, Gideon's mule, shifted and blew. A bird called from the tree line. Evelyn realized she'd been holding her shoulders up near her ears. She made herself let them down. She pressed her hands against her thighs and looked at the empty trail where Hale had gone. He'll come back, she said. Maybe. Gideon was watching the trail too. Let him. He'll bring someone. He doesn't do things himself when he can pay someone else. Then he'll bring someone. He turned to look at her. Are you all right? She thought about the question honestly. I'm angry, she said. I thought I was past being afraid of him, and instead I was just not near him. She shook her head. The moment he said my name, I was 29 and broke and standing in Hale's office again. But you didn't move, Gideon said. She looked at him. He rode in and you were standing there with an axe and a chopping block 2 feet behind you, and you didn't move, he said. You held your ground. She hadn't thought of it that way. She glanced back at the block, where the axe was still sunk into the top of it. I didn't want to reach for it first and give him something to use, she said. I know. That was the right call. He turned back toward the cabin. Come inside. I want to talk about what comes next. What came next was a conversation at the table that lasted 2 hours and covered practical ground. Who in Frost Hollow had any official authority? What recourse Hale actually had legally versus what he'd implied? Whether there was anything that could be done preemptively. Gideon knew the county sheriff, a man named Briggs, who operated out of a town 40 miles south, and he knew him to be a fair man without strong connections to Eastern money. That mattered. If Hale comes back with a man claiming legal authority, Gideon said, we ask for documentation and we send word to Briggs before we do anything else. If he comes back with men without authority, that's a different matter. What kind of different matter? He looked at her across the table. The kind I know how to handle. She studied his face. I don't want anyone getting hurt. I'll keep that in mind, he said, in a way that acknowledged the preference without committing to it unconditionally. She accepted this. She didn't entirely like it, but she accepted it. The week that followed was taut. They went about the work of the trapline and the cabin and the daily business of surviving on the mountain, and they did it with a layer of awareness running underneath everything, listening to the trail, tracking the sounds of the mountain, distinguishing ordinary from wrong. Gideon started going out on the trapline with a rifle he normally left at the cabin. He didn't comment on this. She didn't ask. On the fourth night after Hale's visit, she couldn't sleep. She lay behind the curtain and stared at the dark and listened to the mountain and thought about the look on Hale's face when Gideon had stepped out of the cabin. The way the composure had cracked. She'd watched powerful men for 8 years in Boston, and she'd learned to read the architecture of their confidence, what it was built from, where the load-bearing walls were. Hale's confidence was built entirely from other people's responses to him. The moment the response changed, the structure wobbled. On the mountain and the clearing, with no audience and no leverage, he'd been diminished in a way she'd never seen him diminished. He'd been made ordinary, just a man in the wrong coat in the wrong place. She pushed through the curtain. Gideon was awake. He was sitting by the fire with his coffee, which meant he'd been awake for a while. He looked up when she came through, not surprised. She sat in the other chair. He poured her coffee without asking. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said, "about stories mattering at the right time." He waited. The women he dealt with before me, if there were others, and there were, I know there were, I heard things in that office that I didn't understand the full shape of until afterward. She wrapped both hands around the cup. If they could be found, if there was a way to... She stopped. I have no resources to do that from here. What would it take? Letters. The right letters to the right people. There's a journalist in Boston, a woman named Carrie at the Transcript, who covered the firm's charity work 2 years ago. She's good. She asked the right questions. She looked at the fire. If she heard from multiple women, if there was enough to build a story from. Gideon was quiet, thinking. You'd put your name to it. I'd have to. She paused. He'd know it was me. There's no version of this where I'm not visible. If the story's big enough, being visible is what protects you. She looked at him. He said it simply, like it was obvious. And she sat with it and realized it was that the logic of her safety had been inverted all along. She'd been hiding because she thought invisibility was protection, and the whole time visibility might have been the thing that ended it. I need to get to Frost Hollow, she said. There's a telegraph office. Not alone. I know. She looked at him. Will you take me? Day after tomorrow. I want to check the upper line first, and I want another day to make sure Hale's not sitting at the bottom of the mountain waiting for you to come down. All right. She drank her coffee. The fire burned steady. For what it's worth, Gideon said after a while, I've been thinking about it too, about what he said, that it wasn't finished. He turned his cup in his hands. Men like that. They don't give up because you push back once. They give up because the cost gets too high. What raises the cost? Exposure, he said. Same thing you just said. A story, daylight. He set the cup down. We go to Frost Hollow. You send your letters. And then we come back up here and we wait. And if he wants to come back onto this mountain after that, let him explain to a journalist and a county sheriff why he followed a woman 1,000 miles from Boston to a mountain cabin. It was not a perfect plan. There were gaps in it, places where it depended on people she hadn't spoken to in years responding the way she hoped. On a journalist she couldn't be certain still worked at the same paper. On the fundamental assumption that enough women had experienced enough to constitute a story worth printing. It was a plan with assumptions in it, and assumptions were always the place where things fell apart. But it was something. It was movement. And movement, she had learned over a difficult winter on a mountain that didn't care whether you survived it, was almost always better than staying still. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about Carrie at the Transcript, the way she'd moved through the firm's offices during her coverage, asking questions with a pleasant expression that never quite matched the sharpness behind her eyes. Evelyn had answered every question she'd been asked during that visit. She'd been professional and correct and had thought nothing more about it. She thought about what questions Carrie might ask if the subject were different. She thought about how many women in how many offices had done what she'd done, answered the questions correctly, been professional and correct, and then gone home and tried to figure out what to do with a thing they couldn't report, couldn't prove, couldn't say out loud without becoming the next Evelyn Mercer. She fell asleep thinking about those women. She didn't know yet that across the country, some of them had already started writing their own letters. She didn't know that Hale, despite his composure and his careful construction of his life, had been less careful with others than he'd been with her, had left edges exposed that a journalist with good instincts had already begun to pull at. She didn't know any of that on the mountain in April, in the dark, with the fire on the other side of the curtain, and Gideon in his chair keeping watch the way he did when something was wrong. She just knew she was done being afraid of Victor Hale, and that was enough to sleep on. They went down to Frost Hollow on a Thursday, 2 days after Evelyn had made her decision, the way Gideon had said they would. He checked the upper line first, came back by mid-morning, and they left together with the mule carrying a light load and both of them carrying more than they showed on their faces. The trail down felt different than it had in November. She knew it now. Every turn, every grade change, the section where the ice persisted longest in the shadow of the north-facing cliff, the place where the trail widened and you could see the whole valley spread below. She'd come up this mountain as a stranger. She walked down it as someone who belonged to it, which was not the same as it belonging to her, but was something. Gideon walked beside her for most of it without speaking. He did that, held the silence until there was something worth putting in it. She'd come to value that quality in ways she hadn't expected. She'd grown up around people who filled silence reflexively, as though quiet were a problem requiring immediate solution. They reached Frost Hollow before noon. The town read differently to her now, too. In November, she'd seen it through the eyes of someone arriving desperate, scanning for threats, measuring everything against what she'd left behind. Now she saw a small, imperfect settlement of people doing their best in difficult terrain. Not generous, not cruel, just human in the ordinary ways that meant some of each. Aldous Pratt was sweeping his porch when they came up the main street. He saw Gideon first, then Evelyn, and something moved through his face that was hard to classify. Not shame, exactly. She doubted Pratt was capable of that particular emotion in its full form, but an awareness that the ground had shifted since November, and he was still trying to get his footing on it. He nodded to Gideon, then, after a pause that was a half-second too long, "Mrs. Vale." "Mr. Pratt," she said. Nothing more was said. They walked past. She was aware of Gideon not reacting to this small exchange, and somehow that non-reaction communicated more clearly than comment would have. He'd seen it. It registered. He simply didn't require anything to be made of it. The telegraph office occupied the back quarter of the post office building, operated by a young man named Denny, who had the nearsighted, paper-pale look of someone who spent most of his life indoors reading small type. He took her message without expression. She'd written it out on the trail, on a page from her notebook, 3 concise paragraphs to a journalist named Margaret Carey at the Boston Transcript, stating her name, her location, her willingness to speak in full, and her belief that other women with similar experiences might be found if someone looked. She slid it across the counter. "How long for a response?" she asked. "Depends on whether she's in the office," Denny said. "Day or 2 if she is, longer if the line's busy." She paid from the household money Gideon had given her that morning without being asked, and they went to get supplies. While Gideon dealt with Pratt's store, the transaction wordless and efficient, Pratt's manner careful in a way it hadn't been in November. Evelyn sat on the bench outside the general store and looked at the mountain above the town. You couldn't see the cabin from here. It was too high, hidden behind the first ridge, but she knew exactly where it was. She thought about Victor Hale. She'd spent 9 days since his visit parsing the encounter, examining it for what she'd missed. What she kept coming back to was the moment after Gideon released his lapel, the way Hale had straightened his coat with that automatic reflexive gesture. She'd seen him do exactly that in his office in Boston after any meeting that hadn't gone the way he'd intended. The gesture said, "Surfaces hold. Whatever happens underneath, surfaces hold." She wondered how much of his life was that gesture. Gideon came out with the supplies loaded on the mule, and they started back up before the early afternoon clouds began building over the high peaks. Halfway up, at the section where the trail widened, she stopped. "I want to say something," she said. He stopped beside her, patient. "When I wrote that letter to you. The first one." She looked at the valley below, the town reduced to its component shapes from up here, a cluster of small rectangles against the pale earth. "I was honest with you, but I didn't say the full thing, about why I chose your advertisement specifically." He waited. Most of the others I'd seen were men asking for something, companionship or a worker or something they needed filled. She paused. Yours said, I will not make promises I cannot keep. That was it. That was the whole reason. She turned to look at him. I was so tired of people making promises they were never going to keep. I thought, at minimum, here is a man who is honest about his limits. Gideon looked at her for a moment. The wind moved across the ridge above them, bending the tops of the pines. And, he said, and you were exactly that, she said. Exactly what the letter said. Not more, not less. Honest about your limits. A pause. Which turned out to be quite a lot less limiting than you advertised. Something shifted in his face, that almost smile she'd learned to watch for. You raised the bar, he said. I raised nothing. You were already… She stopped. This was harder to say than she'd thought it would be, standing on a trail in the wind. I'm trying to tell you that I didn't expect to… She stopped again, tried from a different angle. I came up this mountain with no expectations about how I felt about you, and that has changed significantly, and I thought you should know. He looked at her for a long time. I know, he said. She blinked. You know, Evelyn. He said her name the way he said things he'd already thought through completely. I know. She wasn't sure whether to be relieved or annoyed. You could have said something. So could you. She opened her mouth, closed it. That's fair, she said. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just reached out and took it, the way you take something you've decided is yours, steady and without performance. His hand was large and rough and warm despite the cold, and she thought about the night in December when he'd held her face between his palms in the snow and said, look at me, and she'd seen something in him that she'd spent the months since then getting to know properly. They stood on the trail for a moment, hand in hand, looking at the valley below. We should keep moving, he said. Weather's building. I know, she said. They walked back up together. The response from Margaret Carey came in 6 days. Denny sent a rider up the mountain with it, an unusual service that cost extra, which told her something about how Denny had read the message she'd sent. The note was brief, in a handwriting she didn't recognize, but that moved across the page with the decisive pen pressure of someone who wrote for a living and had stopped second-guessing her sentences. Miss Mercer, I received your message. I have been looking for you for 4 months. You are not the first woman to contact me about Mr. Hale, nor the second. Please write fully at your earliest opportunity. I will come to Montana if that is what is required. Monsieur Carey, Boston Transcript. Evelyn read it twice, and then sat down on the step outside the cabin door with the paper in her hands and the mountain all around her, and she felt something in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. Not relief, it was more active than that. Not vindication, it was less certain than that. Something between the two. The feeling of a door that has been sealed for a long time opening an inch, just enough to let air in. She handed the letter to Gideon when he came in from the line. He read it. His expression didn't change, but she'd learned the difference between his expressions not changing and his expression staying deliberately controlled, and this was the second one. 4 months, he said. She'd been looking since January. He set the letter on the table. Write to her tonight. I was going to. She wrote for 3 hours that night, by lamplight, the cabin quiet around her, Gideon working at the bench behind her and making no sound except the occasional small noise of tools. She wrote everything, not the careful, edited version she'd told Victor Hale's face. The real version. The file room, the specific words Colburn had used, the exact language Hale had deployed when she'd reported it, the precise sequence of events that had dismantled her life in the 6 weeks following. She wrote the names clearly and without qualification. She wrote dates where she had them. She wrote what she'd seen, what she'd heard, what she knew about the arrangements between Hale and Colburn that went beyond the assault itself. She wrote until her hand ached, then switched hands and kept writing. When she finished, she set the pen down and read back through what she'd written, and she felt for the first time that she'd told it correctly. Not the version shaped for other people's comfort, the version that was actually true. She folded the pages, addressed the envelope, and set it on the shelf to go down to Frost Hollow in the morning. Then she went to the fire and sat in her chair and looked at the embers and said, "It's done." Gideon looked up from the bench. "Good. "It may come to nothing," she said. "It may, but it's done." "Yeah," he said. "It is." He came to his chair, the one with the cracked rear leg he'd finally repaired in February, and sat with his coffee, and they stayed by the fire together in the easiest silence they'd ever shared, which is saying something, given that they'd spent 6 months building a vocabulary of silences between them. Margaret Carey's story ran in the Boston Transcript 11 weeks later. The writer who brought the newspaper up the mountain, Denny again, developing what appeared to be a side business in mountain postal delivery, brought 3 copies, which suggested Denny had read it and understood it was significant. The headline ran across 2 columns. Evelyn's name was in the 5th paragraph. Carey had spoken to 4 other women, all named, all with stories that rhymed with Evelyn's in their essential architecture. The specificity of the harm, the mechanics of the cover-up, the way each woman had been individually made to feel like an aberration when in fact they were a pattern. Hale's arrest came 17 days after the story ran. A federal warrant on fraud charges connected to the Colburn partnership. Carey had apparently done enough financial digging to surface what Evelyn had only understood in outline. The assault charges were filed separately through a legal channel that one of the other women had found, and they were filed with enough documentation that Hale's lawyers could not make them quietly disappear. She got the news in a letter from Carey, whose handwriting she could recognize by now. He's in custody. His bail was denied on flight risk. The lawyers are going to fight everything, which is expected, but the story is out and it cannot be put back. I want you to know that your letter started something. I also want you to know that you are owed much more than what you're likely to get. Both of those things are true. MC. She was at the table when she read it, the morning light coming through the windows. Glass now. They'd had them fitted in May, and the quality of light in the cabin had changed entirely, become something she stopped to notice, and she sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Gideon was outside. She could hear him at the woodpile. She brought the letter out and handed it to him. He read it standing up in the sun, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. She watched his face while he read. When he finished, he looked at her. She didn't know what she expected. Some acknowledgement, some moment of culmination. What he did was fold the letter, hand it back, and say, "You all right?" She thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to from months of living with a man who asked that question and actually wanted the real answer. "I don't feel the way I thought I'd feel," she said. "I thought I'd feel—" She searched for the word. "Resolved? Finished? I feel—" She shook her head. "Tired, mostly, and relieved, and angry that it took this much." "Yeah," he said. "All of that makes sense." "It shouldn't have required 4 other women and a journalist and 11 weeks and a federal warrant," she said. Her voice had an edge in it. "I told the truth the first day. One person believing me that day would have been—" "I know," he said. "It's not enough. What happened to Hale is not enough for what he did." "No," Gideon said. "It's not. He didn't try to make it more than that, didn't reach for a way to make it tidy. But he's done. He can't come after you. He can't reach you." He looked at her steadily. "That part is finished." She let out a breath. The anger was still there. It wasn't going anywhere, and she wasn't sure it should, because the anger was also accurate. It was a correct response to a real thing, and she'd spent too long in Boston being told that her correct responses were the problem. But underneath it, something had loosened. Not resolved. Loosened. Like a knot that had been load-bearing for so long that it had become part of the structure, and now the load was gone and the knot could just be a knot. Present. No longer holding up everything. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. "I need to split wood," she said. He looked at her for a second, reading whatever was in her face. "I've got the far end," he said. "You take the near stack." They worked through the morning. Summer arrived on Frost Hollow Ridge the way it always did. Briefly, brilliantly, the high alpine meadows going from snow to wildflower in what felt like 2 weeks, the light lasting until 9 at night, the air losing its killing edge and becoming something you could actually enjoy standing in. The mountain revealed itself in summer in ways the winter never allowed. The full extent of the creek system, the meadows on the upper southern slope, the view from the top of the eastern ridge that went on for a distance that Evelyn had stopped trying to quantify and simply stood in front of periodically. They rebuilt the cabin that summer. Not the whole of it. The bones were sound. Gideon had built well, but additions and improvements that the winter had made obvious. They extended the south wall to create a proper working space with a real window. They replaced the oiled paper on the north window with glass to match the others. They built a proper storage structure alongside the cabin, separate from the main living space, so the smell of furs and the smell of food were no longer the same smell. They built the storage structure together, which meant 2 weeks of negotiating over construction decisions that they disagreed about in fundamental ways. She wanted the door on the south face. He wanted it on the east. They went back and forth on this for 4 days before she walked out and said, "South is closer to the cabin. East makes no sense on the grade. You know I'm right." And he was quiet for a moment and then picked up the lumber and started on the south face without comment. She counted that as progress. He taught her to use the rifle properly that summer, not just the mechanics, which she'd learned the afternoon of the bear, but the full practice of it, the patience and the stillness and the understanding of distance and wind. She turned out to be accurate, more accurate with practice than she'd expected. "You hold still well," he told her one afternoon on the upper slope, after she'd put 3 consecutive shots in a pattern he considered respectable. "I've had practice being still," she said. He took that in. "Yeah," he said. "I know." She thought about that. The practice of being still. All those nights in Boston after everything had fallen apart, lying in the dark in the room on Marlowe Street, holding herself together through sheer force of not moving. She'd thought of it at the time as a failure, a weakness, the inability to act. Now she understood it differently. Stillness was a skill. Knowing when not to move, not to react, not to burn everything down in a response, that was something you had to learn. She'd learned it the hard way, which was the only way it stuck. She thought about Thomas sometimes, Gideon's brother. She'd never known him, and never could, but she thought about who he must have been. The gentle young man from Pennsylvania who'd followed his older brother into a war and hadn't come back. She thought about what that loss had made of Gideon over 20 years, the way it had carved him down to something harder than he'd started as, something that kept the world at distance, something that had arrived at the conclusion that loving people made you vulnerable to a grief you couldn't survive twice. She thought he'd been wrong about that conclusion, not foolishly wrong, it was a logical conclusion from the evidence, but wrong in the way that experience proves logic insufficient. Because he'd been on this mountain for 11 years protecting himself from precisely the thing that had, in the end, found him anyway. Found them both. Late in August, on a Thursday evening when the long light was doing what it did at that elevation, turning everything gold and slightly unreal, she was at the table finishing the season's trapline charts, and he came in from the upper line and set his pack down and stood at the window for a moment looking out at the mountain. "I want to say something," he said. She looked up. He was still at the window. "When I wrote that advertisement," he said, I want to be honest about what I was. I was a man who decided the best he could do was survive. Not live. Survive." He paused. "I wasn't looking for what I found." She set her pen down. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. He turned from the window. I don't have a history of doing this well. I've been alone long enough that I know I have habits that are going to be difficult. I know I have nights that are going to be, Gideon." He stopped. "I know your habits," she said. "I've been living with them for 9 months. She stood up from the table. "I know about the nights. I've been on the other side of that curtain for every one of them." She crossed the room and stood in front of him. "I'm not asking for someone who does this well. I'm asking for someone who does it honestly." He looked at her face for a long moment. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said things he'd already decided were true. Flat, direct, without decoration. I've known that for a while. I didn't know how to say it." She put her hand on his face. On the scar, specifically, her fingers resting on the ridge of it, the way she'd wanted to do for months and hadn't because the permission for it had needed to come from somewhere they hadn't yet reached. She felt him go very still under her hand, not pulling away, just receiving it. "I love you too," she said. "I've known for a while also." "Since when?" She thought about it. "February?" she said. "You made me coffee before I was awake. The morning after you told me about Thomas." She dropped her hand. "It was a small thing. I know it was a small thing." "It wasn't," he said quietly. "No," she said. It wasn't. He kissed her then, or she kissed him. The specific mechanics of it somewhat ambiguous, given that they both moved at the same moment, which seemed right. It was not a perfect kiss. It was slightly off-center, and his beard was rougher than she'd accounted for, and she had ink on her right hand from the charts, which transferred to his jaw. He laughed, actually laughed. A short, rusty sound, like a door that hadn't been used in a long time suddenly opening, when he noticed the ink. She hadn't heard him laugh before. Not like that. She thought about the man she'd read about in an advertisement on a park bench in Boston. The man with a bad temper I keep controlled in a cabin on a mountain that no one sensible would want to reach. She thought about the version of herself who'd folded that newspaper into her coat pocket and told no one where she was going. She was glad, with a depth she couldn't fully account for, that she had gotten on that stagecoach. The years went the way years do when you're paying attention to the life inside them, rather than waiting for something else to arrive. Not easily. There was nothing easy about living on Frost Hollow Ridge, not the winters or the work or the particular friction of two imperfect people building a shared life in close quarters with no one else to absorb the overflow. They argued about the storage structure, about the trapline schedule, about the one winter she went down to Frost Hollow alone while he was sick, and he came down after her in a fever because he'd decided she'd been gone too long, which ended in a fight that lasted 2 days and resolved in the particular way their fights resolved, which was each of them eventually finding their way to the same conclusion through different routes, and neither being entirely willing to admit the other had been partly right. She wrote to her father that first summer. Not a full account. She left out most of the Boston years, left out the file room and Hale and all of it, because he was an old man in Connecticut, and there was nothing useful to be done with his guilt about things he couldn't have known or prevented. She told him she was well. She told him she was in Montana, married to a man named Gideon Vale, who had been a soldier and was now a trapper, and that the mountain was hard, but she was harder, which was something she'd learned she was. She told him she was not coming back east, but that she would write regularly. He wrote back in 2 weeks. His handwriting was shakier than she remembered. He said he was glad she was well. He said he'd always known she was harder than she looked. He said he wanted to hear about the mountain. She wrote to him every month after that, until he died 4 years later, and she sent him one of the trapline charts she'd made because he'd been curious about them, and he sent back a letter that said, "I'm putting this on the wall of the store," and she'd stood at the cabin window holding that letter and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't known was still waiting to settle. Gideon's bad nights did not stop. They changed, became less frequent, less severe, the way a chronic thing sometimes modulates once it stops being solitary. But they didn't stop. And she understood by then that they wouldn't, and that was not a failure of recovery, but a fact of what had happened to him. She was there on the other side of the dark when it was bad. That was what she could do. It was not nothing. He was better, she thought, at being alive than he'd been in November when she'd arrived. So was she. That felt like enough. More than enough. It felt like exactly the kind of enough that she hadn't known she was looking for until she found herself standing inside it. People in Frost Hollow changed their minds about the two of them slowly, the way people change their minds about anything. First individually, then in small groups, eventually as a general understanding that the weird mountain trapper and his mail-order wife were simply part of the landscape now, and that the part of the landscape they occupied was theirs. Aldous Pratt stocked a specific blend of coffee she'd mentioned once, and set it aside for her on supply days without being asked. The woman who ran the boarding house brought Evelyn seeds from her kitchen garden in the spring with the slightly aggressive generosity of a person making a sustained apology. Sheriff Briggs, who came through Frost Hollow twice a year, developed a habit of taking supper at their camp when their supply days coincided, and she came to understand that Gideon had saved Briggs's life years earlier in a situation neither man discussed in detail, and that Briggs's presence in the territory was, in some small way, a continued acknowledgement of that. These were not dramatic things. They were the texture of a life in a specific place, the slow accumulation of being known somewhere, which is different from being liked and considerably more durable. The smoke from the cabin on Frost Hollow Ridge was visible from the valley on clear days, a thin line rising from the point where the first ridge met the sky. Travelers on the road south of Frost Hollow had started using it as a landmark. Turn east when you see the smoke above the ridge, in the casual way that settled places become reference points for people passing through. She found this out years later from a passing freight driver who mentioned it without knowing whose cabin it was. She told Gideon that night. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Huh, is that all you have to say about it?" He thought about it. "It's useful," he said. "Being useful isn't nothing." She looked at him across the table. This man with his scarred face and his careful hands and his rusty laugh that she still counted carefully because it was still not common, still a gift each time it came. And she thought, no, it isn't nothing. It is in fact almost everything. The smoke rose from the cabin every morning that winter, every winter after that. It rose in the cold, still air above the ridge, visible for miles, a thin signal to anyone who cared to read it. Someone is up there. Someone survived the night. Someone built a fire this morning and chose, again, to go on. That was the whole of it, and it was enough.